Okay, so chapter 3 section 2 then moves on to start looking at different types of organisational structure. And this first table here that you can see it is based around Mintzberg's building blocks. So if you remember with Mintzberg's building blocks, we had the 6 blocks. So operating core, middle line, strategic apex, support staff, technostructure, and ideology. And what this table sets out to do is try and look at different types of structure in line with Mintzberg. So you can see we've got a column here for the structure, a bit of information about the external environment and what the external environment might be like for this particular structure, and we're actually going to come on and have a look at external environment in more detail later. Internal factors, so what the business is going to be like internally, what the key building block from Mintzberg's model was, and then thinking about what the key coordinating mechanism is. So we're actually going to go through these different types of organisational structure in more detail throughout the rest of this chapter. So this is just a nice summary table really for us to have a quick look at. So you can see we've got there the 5 different structures, so simple, machine bureaucracy, professional bureaucracy, divisionalised, and then ad hoc. So we'll work our way through these throughout the chapter, but just to give you a quick idea here, so you can see that a simple structure, well, what kind of company this is going to be. Well, likely to be quite small, likely to be not particularly old, so quite a new business, and involved in performing simple tasks. Now the key area, according to Mintzberg's model here, would be the strategic apex, so ensuring that top level management and direction is key, and that kind of leads on there to that key coordinating mechanism, where you really have to have that direct supervision. So it's not such a big company that you can't have that direct supervision, so you're able to carry on. If you then kind of thought about a machine bureaucracy where you start to see a much larger company, well, this is where your technostructure is going to be important, because you've got a large company, you're likely to have a large workforce, and therefore standardization of work is going to be key. Just underneath that then, professional bureaucracy. Now thinking about some sort of professional organisation, therefore the operating core is going to be key, because you're going to have that standardisation of skills. Everybody's going to have a particular set of skills, and yeah, as I said, there's a divisionalised and adhocracy there as well. Useful table to have a look over, not necessarily a useful table to memorise, but nice to see those different types before we move on to looking at them in a bit more detail. So over the page there, we'll start running through some of these different structures. First up then, we've got the simple or entrepreneurial structure. So if you think about the type of structure where you're going to have your entrepreneur in the middle there, and then you might have 4 employees around that. So you can see that everything would go through that one main person, so the entrepreneur himself. Now, why is this good? Or sorry, before we go on to advantages, think about features. You'd expect that entrepreneur to have specialist knowledge of whatever you're trying to do. So they're the one that comes up with the idea and then goes to put it in place. And absolutely, they have total control. Advantages, well, there's not multiple layers of decision making going on. So one person makes all the decisions, so they can be made very quickly. Goal congruence. Well, if the entrepreneur is the person running the business, they're the person that owns the business, well then there's no separation between goals there. It's not as if they're expecting somebody else to run the company on their behalf. Finally then, flexible and adaptable to change. There's not lots of levels of management and structure to change if there's a some sort of change in demand or some sort of change in the market. Well, disadvantages, if you imagine our diagram here, the more people I add on here, the more difficult it becomes for that entrepreneur to manage the business. So there is really a limit in terms of size. Can't easily cope with diversification into new products or services, and that may well be because the entrepreneur doesn't have those specialist skills required. Lack of career structure for lower level employees. So for example, back on our diagram, if you imagine being this person, well, there's not really any career progression for you. You're either going to be where you are, or you're going to be the entrepreneur, which obviously isn't going to happen. Finally then, we might say that might say that they're too centralized, and we're going to have a look at centralized versus decentralized a little bit later. So that's the first nice basic simple structure, entrepreneurial, one person in charge with total control. Next then we've got functional structure, which is sometimes called bureaucratic, and this is where different roles are going to be grouped in different functions. So for example, you might have the production team, and then underneath that you're going to have your employees ranked in hierarchy, so managers at the start, then supervisors, then employees. We've actually got a diagram there excuse me, on the next page, so we can have a look at that. What are the features then? Clear lines of reporting. So if we have a look at our diagram, I can see, yep, absolutely, these three people report into manager for product B, and then they report into the production manager overall. They perform a report up into the board of directors. So very clear lines of authority. Formal procedures, paperwork characterize this type of structure, so it's very organized. Okay, so if you think back to the table we saw, we said there's a key, standardization of work. So we want everything to be, adhering to standards. Vertical flow of authority. We're going to look at scalar chain in a second. Can go up and down through the structure from top to bottom. So it's very much that traditional hierarchy structure. And there's our diagram. So you can see all of the key areas of the business organized by function. When is it best to use this structure? If you've got single product or maybe very similar products. If you've got a relatively stable environment, so this structure is very rigid, it's not really suitable for an industry with lots of change, and then again perhaps a smaller enterprise, so one that you perhaps don't have massively different products, or maybe different products or different offices overseas, for example. Advantages then, so absolutely there's a place to go. So if I'm manager of process 3, for example, I know with a bit of hard work and a bit of luck I could end up with as manager of product B, for example. So I know that there's a place for me to go within the organization. Tends to be efficient, so functional tasks are well known and understood. So this is where the structure and the standardization comes in, and then it exploits specialist functional skills. So let's have a look at our departments here. Well, absolutely, you'd expect the people in your finance team to have fairly specialist skills. What are the drawbacks then? As we said, very rigid, so not great for growth, not great for diversification. Tends to see non-participative management styles, and we've seen already that might not be the best way to go in terms of management style. Tend to have slow decisions, so there's lots of layers of decision making to go through, and you might end up with your functional heads building empires. So you might find that I want my function to be absolutely the best, and my goals may not therefore align with the organization overall. Okay, next up then we've got divisional, and this is where we start to see a slightly bigger organization now. And one example might be if you've got lots of different locations, so you might have a European office and a North American office and so on. So definition here of divisionalization. So the division of a business into autonomous regions, so there's some sort of local control, or product businesses. So you might have, for example, a division for your homeware and a division for your groceries if you're a large supermarket. Each with its own revenues, own expenditures, own capital asset purchase program. So all responsible for costs, revenues, and capex items. Okay. So let's have a look at the features of this type of organization. As we said, split in divisions, and it's normally by a product or brand or by geography and location. A good example here for product or brand is that Mars have a pet food arm. Oops. And then obviously they have a chocolate division 2. Geography and location, as I said, might be maybe a US office and an EMEA office. Typically given responsibility for their profits, so that's how they're assessed in terms of performance. In the UK, then, we'd say a typical approach would be to have a holding company and then subsidiaries. So the division might form itself as a subsidiary company. It could be a profit centre within a single business. So here's our example underneath. So we've got our group board, we've got our group services, so your group finance team, and then you've got your division. So for example, this might be Mars Pet Food, this might be Mars Confectionery, and this might be Mars Drinks. So I think Mars have a couple of coffee and tea brands also. And you know, Mars, as I said, is a great example because you could understand why, for example, you know, the pet food side of things needs to be kept separate from the confectionery. And I'm not talking about production techniques. You know, the expertise, the knowledge required to run a successful pet food brand. I think Mars Own Whiskers, for example, would be somewhat different to you know, being able to run a successful confectionery brand. So then within our division 3 there, you can see actually starts to look a lot like that functional structure that we saw before, where now we split into our functions again and then organized in terms of hierarchy. So, you know, a bit of a crossover there. Now this is not necessarily easy to achieve, so we've got certain key conditions that divisionalization requires. What have we got? So firstly, it really relies on authority being delegated. There's no point having these 3 divisional boards if everything is micromanaged from the group board. Each division must be large enough to support the quantity and quality of management it needs. So for example, if Mars also had a 4th division that was something like I don't know, like a greetings card arm, and they sold, you know, 100 greeting cards a year, well, that probably wouldn't need its own board and its own division, so it would be tucked in somewhere else. Mustn't rely on head office for excessive management support. Oops, so that kind of goes hand in hand with our top point there. Must have potential for growth. Should be scope and challenge in the job for the management of each division. So, you know, the option to improve, and we should deal with arm's length transactions between the two. So if there's a transaction between 2 divisions, they should be at arm's length. So that just means that the buyer and seller act independently and pretend there's no relationship there between each other. Not suitable then, if they're a very large or diversified business, you might end up with too many divisions. So when is it most suitable? Well, certainly it's going to be for larger, more diversified businesses, and there is a diversity between byproduct or location. Otherwise, there's not really much point in having that type of structure. In terms of advantages and disadvantages then, advantages, definitely much more flexible and great for developing managers. There's much more management positions, many more management positions to have. Reduces the number of levels of management. Which means that although there might be more managers than say a kind of normal functional structure, there's not so many levels. So we're going to look again at kind of different levels of management a bit later on. Encourages a greater attention to efficiency, lower costs and higher profits. Better decisions on performance because the managers are actually close to what they're talking about. Means that your very top management can concentrate on that strategic direction, and reduces the likelihood of unprofitable products. Okay, so if you're responsible for a division, you're not going to want to run an unprofitable product. Disadvantage then, absolutely central costs are going to be key. So if you think back to our structure, how do we split up the cost of these group services? Okay, so we're going to have to think of some sort of way of allocating costs. Interdivisional trading problems, so thinking about transfer prices. So if division A has to sell to division B, what do we do in terms of profit for each division? And then finally, it might not actually be possible to split divisions out because products might be too similar. So not necessarily always a good idea. Okay, so that's a divisional structure. Finally then, on our structures, we've got matrix, and if if you remember from a previous recording, we discussed matrix structures, whereby it's kind of what you'd expect to see in a project. Okay, so we now have vertical and lateral lines of communication, so it's no longer a hierarchy from top to bottom. We also have lateral communication. Might be temporary, so if you've got a one-off project, and they've done a nice diagram underneath here to explain what's going on. So for example, our chap here, X, reports into both the marketing manager and also the manager of product B. So X might be a member of the marketing team who's just been taking out to work on a particular project, so now has two essentially people to report into. Where does this fit in then? So let's have a look what it's most suitable to. Complex or high-tech industries, so where there's lots of projects going on all the time, certainly works better there. Excuse me, perhaps educational establishments. So if you think about an English teacher at your secondary school, well, they'd report both into the head of the English course, and also perhaps if it's a particular area of English, they would report into them as well. Also works well in R&D departments where, again, lots of projects going on. What's good about it? Well, it gives your project particular importance. So it shows that we're actually considering the importance of the project, and it coordinates in terms of technology and information. So we're sharing lots of information. What's bad? Well, it's sometimes difficult to have two bosses. There might be an issue in terms of allocation of resources. And then you might find that if you're a functional head, for example, our marketing manager here, well, maybe I'm not too happy about one of my employees having to report into somebody else as well. So that's a look at a few different organizational structures. The next recording then will be section 3, which looks at centralization and decentralization.